I mentioned in the last segment that democracy in England places all its confidence and all its power in Parliament. Parliament is the ultimate authority. Parliament can decide. But although we have a legislative branch in America, we have the House, we have the Senate, Congress does not have that kind of virtually unchecked power. And there are many issues on which Congress cannot decide. And so, for example, Congress cannot decide to take away your free speech. Congress does not have the power to decide that you don't have equal rights under the law. In fact, Congress cannot decide that all men are not created equal. Now, why not? Why can't Congress pass those kinds of laws? Well, the answer is that in the American system of government, Congress is itself under other types of authority that have their own jurisdiction, their own legitimacy, their own domain, and in some cases, namely the Constitution, supersede anything that Congress decides. So Congress can decide nothing that goes against the Constitution. In fact, there's a whole body, as we know, the Supreme Court, whose job it is to tell Congress when Congress is overstepping its bounds and encroaching or undermining the Constitution in any way. So the Constitution, you might say, is a super law. And if you ask yourself, where does the Constitution kind of come from? The answer is the Constitution is the kind of original compact that establishes America, that is a kind of founding charter that has an authority that Americans in any particular generation cannot override, or cannot override except in very extreme cases. So there is a way to amend the Constitution. It's very hard to do. You need supermajorities in the House, supermajorities in the Senate. You need the presidency. You then need state ratification. So it's deliberately very hard to change. You can change it, but it almost requires a virtual consensus of the American people that, yeah, we gotta add this in there. But otherwise, the Constitution sort of presides over America. But notice that we don't vote on the Constitution. The Constitution, we don't control the Constitution. It controls us. In that sense, it constitutes or makes the society to the kind of society that it is. Now, why do we have all this? Why do we have a Constitution? Why do we create a super law? Why do we empower courts who are unelected to have this kind of power? Well, the reason is really simple, and that is that the founders believed, and Madison's perhaps is the father of the Constitution, so I use Madison, but I'm only naming Madison as a kind of stand-in for the founders. Pretty much all the founders had this view, and the view is this, that yes, if one man lords it over everybody else, that is the tyranny of the one. If 10 people or a small gang does the same thing, that's the tyranny of the few, oligarchy. But if the majority lords it over the minority and oppresses the minority and takes away the rights of the minority, then we have tyranny of the majority. And this tyranny is no less objectionable than the other forms of tyranny. Maybe it affects fewer people because the king is oppressing everybody, but the majority is only oppressing 49% or 41% of the population, but that's still a big chunk of the population. And the premise of the American founding is that there are certain things, certain rights that we have as individuals. And these rights do not come from the state. We have them by virtue of being human. This is the point of all men are created equal. We're made in such a way that being human, which is to say not being animals, horses, for example, don't have a right not to be ridden, not to be saddled, not to be controlled by man. It is the nature of a horse that they can be and are dominated by human beings. But human beings don't have that kind of right to dominate each other. And so our individual rights are to this degree. And the founders use this very interesting word. We sometimes say inalienable. I think the founders said unalienable. And unalienable means that these rights are, well, you can't give them away, even if you want to. Even if you want to, you can't say, listen, I'm going to be your slave for life. From now on, I'm your slave. I'm going to sell myself into slavery for 50 cents. You can't do it. You're not allowed to do it. Why? Because your rights are not up for being traded away even by you. So when you start with this premise of inviolable rights, in the view of the founders, and specifically Madison, it follows that governments are established, but established for what purpose? Well, they're established for the purpose of protecting these rights. And so whether it's the minority or the majority, that's simply an argument about which group is going to be doing the protecting. But the rights themselves are not up for adjudication. Now, I say all this recognizing that there's been so much of a violation of these principles, so much of a trampling on these principles really by the left. And in the next segment, I'll talk a little bit more about that and how that came about. But what I'm getting at is that the founders, I think, were not hung up, you might say, between are we a democracy or are we a republic? What the founders would say, I think, is that we are a constitutional democracy, which is to say we're a democracy, but we're a democracy under a constitution. We're a democracy that does permit and affirm majority rule, but only majority rule that is consistent with the protection of minority rights. Yes, we're a democracy in which we have elected leaders and they have power, but that power is circumscribed and limited by what? By the Constitution. The Constitution says that the government shall do this and the government shall do that. And beyond that, the Constitution doesn't give the government any other kind of power. Now, again, I'm talking about the way, the constitutional architecture or arrangement of how the country was set up. We now have to consider how this delicate and I would say, beautifully constructed arrangement was desecrated, pushed to the side, and abridged by a movement that developed in the early 20th century, a movement called progressivism. This is now the founding movement of the Democratic. This is the movement that's taken over the Democratic Party. And the essence of progressivism is to subvert not only the Republican side of government, but also the Democratic.